រីករាយខួប70ឆ្នាំនៃទំនៀមទម្លាប់ការទូតរវាងប្រទេសកម្ពុជានិងប្រទេសអូស្ត្រាលី
Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm very happy to be joined by Ambassador Pablo Kang, Australian Ambassador to Cambodia. Ambassador, very good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I believe that last time we met and we had discussed much issue related to Cambodian and Australia bilateral relations, but in broader term. But this year is very remarkable as our tie reached 70 years already. So it has been so long that we have been friends, have been partners, and so on. And your country have been contributed a lot to our country development. Just to name a few, from education to governance reform to rural development, social security, and so on. So I would like to learn from you more about the over past 70 years. For example, like current relations. So to begin with, I would like to ask you a very simple question. What is your assessment of the current bilateral relation between the two countries over the past 70 years?
Okay, well thank you and thanks to everyone who's watching. You're right, 70 years is a big achievement. There's not that many countries that have had diplomatic relations with Cambodia for 70 years, and of course that means that when we established relations back in January 1952, Cambodia was still part of the French Union back then, had not fully attained independence. That was to follow the next year. As Prime Minister Hun Sen commented recently, the recognition, the decision of countries such as Australia and a few others to establish diplomatic relations before independence was a great catalyst to Cambodia eventually gaining independence from France in 1953. Now the relations, I think over 70 years, we talk about it's been 70 years of diplomatic relations, which basically means we agreed to exchange diplomatic representatives between Cambodia and Australia. Very much a government-to-government decision. But I would say the relationship has largely been driven by the people-to-people links. So if you think about, for example, the fact that so many Cambodians have studied in Australia, starting right back in the early 1950s, just after we established diplomatic relations, the first Cambodian students went to Australia under a program that was called the Colombo Plan back then, and that was set up to bring students from across the Asia-Pacific region to Australia in the aftermath of the Second World War, to gain knowledge, to exchange information and cultural understanding, and to obviously get a good educational qualification. Since 1994, we've had nearly 22,000 Cambodians study in Australia. That's quite a remarkable number, and I meet them every day almost. In fact, you're about to join quite an exclusive list but a growing list. So many Cambodians have studied in Australia. We've provided nearly 1,000 scholarships since 1994 for Cambodian students to study at master's and PhD level in Australia. So there is a really good cohort, if you like, of Cambodians who not only have studied in Australia, but of course have lived in Australia. In many cases have taken their families with them. Their children have gone to school in Australia. Their partners have worked. So it really helps to improve the understanding between the two countries. Now, not just that, of course, but many Cambodians have actually moved to Australia permanently. They've gone to Australia as migrants, sometimes as refugees, during the Khmer Rouge period and the aftermath in the 1980s, and they've settled in Australia. Others have just gone to Australia as an economic decision, if you like. So if you look at the number of Australians who have Cambodian background, it's about 66,000, which is quite a significant number for a population of 16 million, and Australia's population about 25 million. The town of Kampong Thom is about 66,000 people. So if you look at it that way, it's about everyone who lives in Kampong Thom. That's the sort of number of Australians who have Cambodian background. And they make a very important contribution to Australia's very culturally diverse society. and still retain a very active interest, of course, in Cambodia. And in fact, I know a lot of Cambodians who having gone to Australia when they were very young, sometimes as refugees with their parents, have now come back to Cambodia to do business and to do very successfully. So the bedrock of the 70 years of diplomatic relations, I think, is in the people-to-people links. Of course, Australia has helped Cambodia, and Cambodia has helped Australia at that time. During that time, at the government-to-government level, we've had a number of development assistance programs, which I can talk about more later, government-to-government contacts and so on, a big role that Australia played in the Paris Peace Agreements, in the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia that followed that, and we're celebrating actually 30 years of that this year as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador. It has been a very fruitful years, and you give us a very comprehensive assessment of the relationship. But as Ambassador yourself, can you tell us what are the biggest achievements or the achievement that you're most proud of when it comes to these bilateral relations reaching 70 years?
Yes, well, I think the fact that Australia, in the course of the 70 years, played a very important role in helping bring peace to Cambodia. If you ask a lot of Australians about Cambodia, of course they'll say, oh, Angkor Wat, you know, beautiful temples. Then they'll think about the Khmer Rouge, right? And for Australians who know Cambodia more than that, they'll think about Australia's role in first helping to broker the Paris Peace Agreements, which were signed in October 1991. I think without those agreements, we wouldn't have been able to bring the different warring factions to the table with the promise of the United Nations playing a transitional governing role for Cambodia. That was a big diplomatic initiative by a number of countries, not just Australia, of course. You know, France, Indonesia, Japan, they all played a big role. But certainly at the time, I think Australia was very influential and is still regarded as such. Even if you ask the senior leadership of the Cambodian government today, they have very clear memories and recollections of Australia's role. Then, of course, the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia that followed that. General John Sanderson, who led the military component of UNTAC, and around 1,200 other Australians who played roles in UNTAC, whether it be military, police, civilian roles. That was a huge contribution from us. So if I was to pick one thing, or maybe two things, it'd be the Paris Peace Agreements and UNTAC, because that's what Australia is probably most well known for in the history of Cambodia.
But what about the current or the latest contribution? Can you name
Sure.
one of it?
Can I name one thing? Very difficult to name one thing. Currently, if I had to name one thing, I would say, well, of course, COVID Doprambun is in Cambodia, as it is everywhere. And we made a very conscious decision at the beginning of the pandemic to help Cambodia, manage its response to COVID. Of course, a big part of that response has been vaccines and vaccinations. And so I think the fact that Australia was able to, through our own grant funding, provide 2.35 million doses of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine to Cambodia in December last year. That is now being rolled out in Phnom Penh, first of all, as fourth doses. So anyone who's had a fourth dose has probably had it through Pfizer, and that's through Australia. But then also we're now helping to bring those vaccines to the provinces. We recently took delivery of 33 ultra-cold freezers, which are now being sent to the provinces, and they will allow the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine to be stored for longer periods, you know, and I'm talking about minus 80 degrees, right? So that means that people in the provinces won't have to come to Phnom Penh to get their vaccines. They can now get them in where they are. And also it means that future donations of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine will also be able to be delivered immediately to the provinces. So we've partnered with UNICEF also on public awareness and education campaigns in relation to social distancing, personal hygiene, the benefits of getting vaccinations. We've helped train health force workers as well, and provided some of that cold chain supply equipment and personal protective equipment. So we've done, I think we've done a pretty big job in the context of Cambodia's vaccination rollout and broader response to COVID.
I see. Thank you, Ambassador. Let me move to one of the most important issue, education. So in education in particular, I believe that Australia have been doing a lot, just like many other partners, but in terms of providing education opportunity to women, to disabled people, to also many young scholars in Cambodia from even the provinces, many of them traveling to Australia to pursue their education. Because you believe that this is going to be the future leader, the leader who assist the development of the country. But over the past 70 years, well, you talk about Colombo Plan, and then there's an Australian Award Scholarship. So are you optimistic about what you're doing with the firm and generous support in terms of education?
Yeah, I'm very optimistic. The next generation of Cambodians, it's going to be up to them to keep taking the country forward. Yeah. You know, the older generation, or the generation that was there around the time of the Khmer Rouge and immediate aftermath, you know, they're getting quite old now. But you know, I meet so many Cambodians who have studied in Australia and who've come back and are doing very well, whether that be in the government, in the private sector, in civil society, as you say, from the provinces, from Phnom Penh. Many women, like I think over 50% of our current scholarship intake are women, which is something that we've been putting a lot of emphasis on. People with disabilities, and they all say the same thing. They all say that their time in Australia was a life-changing experience for them, not just for the study, but just being exposed to a different society, a different culture, maybe a different way of thinking, yeah. A particular set of values, lifestyle, just a different way of thinking to what they're used to, right? And I think that kind of exposure to different views, different opinions, different techniques, different people is of great benefit. And I see the younger generation who have come back and are doing so well in Cambodia today, and I think that's a very good sign for the future.
Thank you, Ambassador. So 70 years, maybe it has been long when it comes to counting the number, but how do you see the bilateral relation between the two in the next 70 years?
In the next 70 years.
And of course, at the same time, the Thai might reach different level. Cambodia also reach different step of development. What should be the priority in terms of support that your country is going to offer to the country?
Yeah, I think it'll be a different relationship. You know, the first 70 years, of course, Cambodia has been developing, and obviously in the aftermath of the Khmer Rouge, really starting from scratch in many ways. So a developing country, a developing economy. Australia's placed a lot of priority on assisting, especially countries in our region. We very much think of ourselves as part of the Indo-Pacific region, so we're neighbours with Cambodia. We're not that far away, we're in a very similar time zone. We have all those people-to-people links already. So we put a lot of priority on it, on helping countries like Cambodia, because if you help countries in the region, then you're helping the stability and prosperity of the region, and we're part of the region. So it's in our interests as well. But you know, the next 70 years will be different because Cambodia's been growing and growing, and notwithstanding COVID, which has obviously been a bit of a bump in that growth trajectory. But before COVID, you know, Cambodia was averaging 6-7% growth every year. There is still the intention to try and hit higher middle income status or upper middle income status as a country by 2030 and higher income status by 2050. So if that happens, the relationship will change because there won't be so much emphasis on development assistance, but more on trade and investment, ongoing people-to-people links. Cambodia won't require the kind of assistance that it needs now from international partners, from its own government budget, etc. So I think, you know, we've been looking at our development assistance program of actually starting that journey, that transition, moving away from funding projects where we build things ourselves in villages, small-scale projects, and more working with the systems, working with the government budget, working with other partners, the private sector, to help encourage that kind of growth, because that's what Cambodia will need in the future. So the next 70 years, Cambodia will be a much more developed economy, I think, and as such, the relationship with Australia will be more like the relationship we have now with other developed economies, where we don't have a bilateral aid program, right? We have trade and investment, trade agreements. We have a lot of sort of, if you're looking into the future, the Industrial Revolution 4.0, which Cambodia is very keen to embrace, as is Australia. A lot more sort of high-tech focus, a lot more focus, for example, on renewable energies, lower emission energy technologies, all those kinds of things that basically we're starting to look at now. But up until this point, a big focus has been on assisting with agriculture, assisting with basic infrastructure, assisting with basic healthcare, the scholarships. A lot of countries around the world where we have relations with, we don't provide scholarships to because they're developed economies. So at some point, if we get to the point where we won't provide scholarships to Cambodia, you'll have to think of that as a good thing. Because that means that Cambodia has become an advanced economy. A lot of Cambodians, of course, also fund themselves to study in Australia, right? We've had 22,000 Cambodians since 1994. The majority of those have been self-funded. Only about 950 scholarships in that period. But over time, that will become 100%.
I see. Thank you, Ambassador. So it's not just about your support in terms of education and then development assistance and social economics development as well, but because of when we look at the global perspective from our views, and then we see there's a lot of issues facing the world right now, including backtrackings of liberal democracy and so on, and many countries in the region have faced that. And by mentioning this, Cambodia itself is going to hold elections in June for communal election, and next year election for the national ones. So as friend and partner, can you share with us what your country has been doing to ensure that the country will be moving forward and successfully hosting this election with free and fair and in a democratic way? Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, it's an important question, and if you look at Cambodia's constitution, which was developed during that UNTAC period, Article 1 talks about Cambodia, the Kingdom of Cambodia, as being based on the principles of liberal multi-party democracy, right? So these are very fine words. Of course, the challenge is to ensure that they are the reality, and that is an ongoing challenge for Cambodia, definitely. And I think a challenge that maybe other countries in the region don't face as much, because other countries in the region, including Cambodia's immediate neighbours, have different systems of government, maybe only have one party, do not have a civil society to speak of, right? But they don't have a constitution that says that they're a liberal multi-party democracy. So that's Cambodia's burden to bear, if you like, and aspiration to live up to, right, if I put it in a positive way. So I think there'll be a lot of focus on the commune elections, firstly this June, and then next year's national elections, of course, especially what happened in 2017, 2018. People still remember that. Now we do what we can, along with other countries that are also concerned about these issues, to encourage, firstly, the government to hold elections, as you say, that are free and fair, that there is proper contestability, that people from all different political persuasions can firstly run as candidates, run free from harassment or intimidation, like run fairly, register in the usual way, and that people are free to support who they want. And if you look at the top levels of government here, the Prime Minister or Deputy Prime Minister Sa Keng, they've said a few things recently which we would encourage, right? And it's, for example, the registration process at the commune level should be unimpeded, and other political parties that are not the CPP should be allowed to put up their, banners and signs and have their candidates talk freely and so on. Now, the message that we're receiving on the ground, however, is a little bit different, and I think so that top level message may not be getting down to the ground level in all cases. So that's something that we need to continue to encourage the government to work on. But it's not just about words. So for us, we're looking at different projects where we actually support civil society and independent media to monitor the lead up to the elections and the holding of the elections, and so that they can come to their own views about whether the elections were free and fair and based on the democratic principles that are so enshrined in Cambodia's constitution. So, it is a work in progress, but there will be a lot of interest and a lot of attention on it, and certainly from Australia's perspective, a lot of interest and attention. Part of the reason why there is that interest and attention is what I was saying before. There are 66,000 Australians of Cambodian descent, and they all take a very keen interest in what's going on in Cambodia, as you would, the country of your ancestry, or in some cases the country of your birth. And of course other Australians who worked in Cambodia, UNTAC for example, also take a keen interest in the development of Cambodia, because of course UNTAC was again led to the constitution, which has those principles in it. And so it's certainly in our interests overall to keep the focus on Cambodia's democratic journey, but we have a personal interest as well.
Thank you, Ambassador. If you don't mind, let me move a little bit back to the 70th anniversary. I just want to get your frank advice to our youth. There's a lot of youth activity. There's a growing number of youth-led program in almost every aspect of society, from entrepreneurship to environment, to social development, to education, and so on. As ambassador, friends, and partner, what's your advice to them, and what your views on this kind of trends that Cambodia has been seeing over the past, maybe few years?
It's a great trend. Of course, Cambodia is a very young country. Unlike Australia, 2/3 of your population is under 30. That means that 2/3 of Cambodians were not born during the UNTAC period, right? Because that's 30 years. So, I think because Cambodia is a young society, it has been a rapidly growing society, in terms of the economy. Things like Industrial Revolution 4.0, the uptake of e-commerce, in particular during COVID, how that's kind of by necessity spread even further. I think Cambodia was already very well practiced at e-commerce. I use things like Nyam, Mapaibun, Grab, ABA Pay. Sorry, I don't mean to promote a certain bank, but I use those apps every day, right? And they're so great. But during COVID, I think it's gone to another level. And you talked about entrepreneurs. I've met a lot of particularly young women entrepreneurs, and we know that women own the majority of micro and small, medium enterprises in Cambodia. They're very entrepreneurial, and they use the internet, they use those online applications to further their business. Education we talked about, but I think the trends that Cambodia is going down, the path to an emphasis on science and technology, the STEM subjects, I think that's very important for Cambodia. Cambodia's had a great record over the years in access to education, but now the challenge is to get to the next level, which is to improve the quality of education. Not just having kids turn up to school, but actually having teachers who are well trained and can provide a good education. So these are all challenges, but it's an exciting time, I think, to be in Cambodia. If you're a young person under 30, which like two-thirds of you are, hopefully, and I'll touch wood when I say this, moving out of the pandemic or moving more to an endemic type situation, there's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of light at the end of the tunnel. Tunnel's been very long, of course. We're not out of it yet. But for young people, I think there's a lot of good reasons to be optimistic.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your overview and also advice to young people as well. So let me move to current Cambodia chairmanship. I mean, as ASEAN, sorry,
Yes.
current ASEAN chairmanship Cambodia is holding. So I think it's 3 months right now since the early 2022. So there's a lot of challenge Cambodia has been trying to deal with as the heads of or leading the organization. So from your side, what has Australia been doing to support Cambodia to ensure that its chairmanship will be able to help or lead the region to get out of this?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I think like Australia has a very long-standing relationship with ASEAN. So ASEAN, of course, there's 10 members of ASEAN, and there's 11 dialogue partners. They're not members, but they're very close partners of ASEAN. And Australia's the oldest. So Australia became a dialogue partner of ASEAN back in 1974, right?
Yeah.
And then last year, ASEAN decided that it would elevate its relationship with Australia to what we call a comprehensive strategic partnership. There's only 2 countries that ASEAN has a comprehensive strategic partnership with, and they both decided last year, Australia and China. So that's, I think, a real recognition of that long-standing relationship that we've had, the cooperation, the economic, technical, development cooperation we've had with ASEAN in that time. And so it's a perfect time in a way for Cambodia to be taking on the chair of ASEAN as we are now a comprehensive strategic partner. And I think, of course, it's not an easy time with, as you say, with Myanmar. That's I guess was an unforeseen issue until the coup happened a bit over a year ago. Ukraine, again, another issue that's come up very quickly, a crisis that ASEAN has also had to consider. And then the broader challenges of, as you say, managing a recovery from COVID, economically, tourism, people to people, health, of course, health security. How does that happen? We've put a lot of focus into supporting Cambodia and talking very actively with Cambodia in its chair role. So our Foreign Minister, Maurice Payne, she visited Cambodia in November last year, just as actually Cambodia had formally taken over the chairing responsibility, even though it didn't actually start until the beginning of this year. But they took it over from Brunei in October last year. She visited in November. We had a lot of very good discussions on how we could support Cambodia in its chairing role. Our ambassador to ASEAN, who's based in Jakarta, visited in January this year, and then only a few weeks ago, our senior ASEAN official, Katrina Cooper, visited from Canberra. So we've put a lot of focus into actually talking to Cambodia about these issues, about COVID recovery, about Myanmar, Ukraine most recently. A few practical things that we've done. Firstly, Cambodia's got putting a lot of emphasis in its chair year to women's economic empowerment and advancing the cause of gender equality. And Cambodia is quite progressive, I think, when it comes to these issues. So Cambodia will host ASEAN Women Leaders Summit this year as part of its chairing role, and we are actively supporting that, both from a policy sense and a financial sense. So that's something that we're already doing. Also, it's a big year for ASEAN on the trade agenda. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, the big FTA, has just come into force. It's entered into force now from the beginning of this year. Australia is a member, Cambodia is a member. Also, we have our own free trade agreement with Cambodia and ASEAN. It's the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, and we're looking to upgrade that by September this year to make it a more modern, more e-commerce focused free trade agreement. So to help Cambodia with all these things, we've actually, if you like, donated one of our offices from our foreign ministry, which is also our trade ministry. So it's our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, to actually work in the Ministry of Commerce this year. So he's actually working there for 12 months to help Cambodia on the ASEAN economic agenda side. There's other things that we're looking to do this year with Cambodia in its ASEAN chair year, especially around Myanmar. We're very supportive of ASEAN's leadership on Myanmar and Cambodia's efforts as the chair. We know the Foreign Minister, Deputy Prime Minister Prat Sakhonn is visiting Myanmar next week as the ASEAN Special Envoy. We've had a number of discussions about that, about how we think Cambodia could try and progress a very difficult relationship between Myanmar and not just ASEAN but the international community, and with a very, very serious situation on the ground. COVID recovery, of course, will be a big theme, and I think trade and investment, that side of the ASEAN agenda is really going to help. There'll be a very good focus on RCEP, I think, this year that you'll see, but also things like encouraging women and economically empowering them, because women will have a critical role to play in the economic recovery, given that within ASEAN so many of the small businesses that we've discussed are owned, managed and run by women.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for your comprehensive assessment of the Thai as well as your perspective on the current Cambodia chairmanship of ASEAN. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Same.